All right, it's Friday and 1:00 p.m. here in North Carolina, USA, and that's time for weekly Latin studies. So let's get settled in, and you can relax because I'm going to do most of the work today, or almost all of the work today. So let's see, make sure everyone gets in here. Looks like everyone's settling in. Give me a wave if you can hear me okay. All right, great. So we're ready to go here. In our Latin studies so far, we took the first class, we talked about the letters and things like that, pronunciation. And then we got into the study of grammar, the second part of the study of grammar, which is the study of the different forms of words. And we talked about the parts of speech. Those of you who have been joining me for these classes, you should be able to name the 8 parts of speech, and you should have a good idea of what each of the 8 parts of speech is. And then over the past 2 weeks or so, we've been starting to learn about the accidents of the parts of speech, which means we're learning about the different characteristics of those 8 parts of speech. We looked at in the first, let's see, in the first talk about the accidents of parts of speech, we talked about, let's see, person. I'm sorry, we talked about number, singular and plural. And we talked about cases last week. So you should know what the two numbers are in Latin, and you should know what the 6 cases are in Latin, and you should know what each of them is used for. I'll give you a little quiz real quick. You can answer on the chat. First of all, if I'm writing or speaking in Latin, or if someone was writing or speaking in Latin, and they want to express a noun that is the subject of a verb, what case would they use to express a subject? What case would they use to show that a noun or a pronoun or a participle is a subject? If you're writing question marks in your answer, you shouldn't be answering, because I didn't ask you to ask me a question. I asked you to give me an answer. So nominative case, good. We've got to work on spelling a little bit, but that's okay, because could just be simple typos. All right, good. So the subject is expressed with a nominative case. If I have a verb like throw, and I say, I throw the ball, what case would the ball be in Latin? What case would the ball be in? The ball is the object of the verb. I throw the ball. What case would the ball be in if I wrote that in Latin? Accusative case, very good. Okay, the accusative case, good. If you wrote accusative, or if you're thinking accusative, you're right. All right, next. If I wanted to speak to someone directly, let's say I was saying a prayer and I wanted to say, "Oh Lord," and I mentioned the Lord's name and I address the Lord directly, what case would I use to address a person or thing directly? Vocative. Vocative is the correct answer. So if you wrote vocative or thought vocative, you're right. If I said, the Bible is the word of God, and I took that phrase "of God" and I said, I want to express that in Latin, how would I say "of God" in Latin? What case would I use to express the phrase "of God"? Nope, 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 nope. Wrong answers, wrong answers. Okay. Giovanni, I think, got it first. Giovanni and Joshua. It's the genitive case. The phrase "of God," it shows possession. Possession is shown by the genitive case. If I wanted to say, I wrote a letter to John, how would I express the phrase "to John" in Latin? What case would I use to express the phrase "to John"? That's the dative case. Very good. Okay, that's the dative case. And then lastly, there's one more case. Usually if I want to use an expression that follows a preposition or expresses the idea of origin, like from, if I said, I traveled to Greece from Rome. What case would I put from Rome in? What case would I put Rome in if I wanted to express an origin? It's the only one that's left, so that should be a pretty easy guess. It's the ablative case, all right? Now, if you answered those questions easily, that's great. If you thought to yourself while I was asking those questions, I think I'm on the wrong planet, I have no idea what he's talking about, well, then you just need to go back and watch that previous week's video where I talked about the cases and what the different cases are used to express. And it just takes some time to learn that stuff. And you don't need to worry because we're going to study that and talk about that through our entire study of the course of Latin grammar. But you should be able to state the names of the 6 cases, and you should have an idea what each of the 6 cases is used for, okay? Our topic for today is gender. Our topic for today is gender. And you don't have to worry, we're not going to get into any weird stuff you see in the news or anything like that. This is grammar gender. This is gender in grammar. So we're going to talk about the grammar of nouns, participles, and pronouns. We're going to talk about gender, and that starts down here in rule number 15 in our lesson. Let me share my screen. It's time to share my screen here. So we studied gender. Give me a quick wave if you can see the rules on my screen. Everybody see that? Good. Okay. I'll zoom in a little bit more here so it's bigger. So we're down in rule 15 on the lesson page. And the next accident that we study, the next characteristic of the parts of speech that we study is gender. And yeah, gender has a simple idea like male and female. That's simple enough. That's really simple, natural gender. But remember, this is grammar class, and it's not exactly talking about natural gender. It's not asking whether a thing is a boy or a girl, because you can imagine that would only apply to animals, whether it's male or female. Most of the stuff we talk about is actually not living. So it gets a little more complicated than just being about, is this a male or a female? So in rule number 15 here in our lesson, we learn about the genders. And what I'd like to do today is explain this and make it as simple as possible for you. Okay, so why we need to understand the genders, why we need to identify the genders. And in Latin class, why do we have to spend so much time and give so much attention to gender? Why do we have to do this? Because it doesn't work like English. In English, we never talk about gender in English. Again, unless we're talking about some wacky stuff in the news, we rarely talk about gender. It's not that important for us. But in Latin and Greek, it's extremely important because of the ways that the language works. And if you think back, we talked about how in English, most of the things that we express, most of the complex ideas we express by using phrases. We like to use phrases in English, multiple words to express an idea. In Latin and Greek, they tried to avoid that, and if they could express an idea with one word by just changing the form of the word, that's how they would do it. So they didn't like to use phrases in Latin and Greek. And you can imagine when paper was very expensive and hard to come by, it wasn't like today where you just go buy boxes and boxes of paper at Walmart. When paper was very difficult to get a hold of, and when buildings need to be inscribed and things like that, men had to actually carve words into stone. It's a good idea to be able to communicate in as few words as possible. And so they tried to make the language as simple as they could with as few words as they could. The problem is they wanted to identify the gender of different things by the forms of the words. So when we look at the form of a noun or a participle or a pronoun, we're going to see that the gender of that word is included in the form of that word. So not only is the number included, singular or plural, not only is the case included, one of the 6 cases, but also the gender of the thing that's being talked about, the gender of the thing that's named, the gender is also given in the form of that word. So there's all of this information packed into the form of a Latin word. And the reason why this is so important is because we have to put words together. So for example, if I say the green tree, right? The green, let's say the green grass, that's better. The green grass. So I've got these 2 words and they're joined together. Grass is a substantive noun, and then green is an adjective noun that describes the grass. So they go together. If they were the subject of a sentence or the object of a sentence, they would go together. Green grass. So the problem in Latin is that the word green has different forms because the adjective has different forms and grass has different forms. And what we've got to do is we've got to make sure that their forms match up, that they have the same number, the same case, and the same gender. So we've got to match up the forms and make sure they always agree. Likewise, with pronouns, a pronoun is a word that stands in place of a noun. If I'm talking about a girl, and then I want to use a pronoun to refer to her, I have to use a feminine pronoun because I'm referring back to a girl. So I have to have a feminine pronoun. So I've got to always make sure that if I use a pronoun, that pronoun has the same gender as the noun that I'm using it in place of. So in Latin, it's very important to understand the genders and to think about the genders, because every single time in Latin that you use an adjective or a pronoun or a participle, you've got to make sure that you've got the gender right, because that word has to have the same gender in its form, has to have the same gender as the noun that it represents. So you can see why in Latin, they've got to think about gender all the time, where for us, really, the only time we think about gender is when we're using pronouns. We have to choose to use he or she or it. Outside of that, we really don't think too much about gender. But in Latin, you have to think about gender every single time you use an adjective or a pronoun or a participle. So it's much more important to know gender. All right, having said that, there are 3 main genders. There are 3 genders. Really, there are only 2 main genders. The 2 genders are masculine and feminine. And then there's a 3rd gender that's not really a gender, because it's the word that means neither. It's neuter. So we've got 3 main genders, but really only 2 of them are genders. The other one is not gender. So we've got masculine, which normally refers to male animals. We've got feminine, which refers to female animals. And then we've got the 3rd gender, which is called neuter. And the word neuter in Latin just means neither. So it's neither male nor female, neither masculine nor feminine. So we've got 3, these are called the 3 principal genders. And you can see this in the rule here, the principal genders. There are 3 main genders, and it's good to compare this to colors to make it really clear. If you have crayons, you can go to the store and you look at crayons and you've got like a box of 8 crayons. Maybe you buy that for a little kid, like a 2-year-old. You can get him a box of 8 crayons and he's happy with that. But then when you get older and you start getting a little fancier with your coloring and your drawing, you say, I don't want that cheesy box of 8 crayons. I want that big monster box with like the 48 or 64 crayons. I need 100 different shades of brown for my drawings. So you go and you get the bigger box with the more crayons. But really, every single crayon comes from just a few primary colors. There's a few primary colors. And if we were to name the primary colors, normally they're named as red, yellow, and blue. Red, yellow, and blue are the primary colors. They're like the primary genders. Every other color that exists can be made from red, yellow, and blue, right? If you want to make orange, you don't have to have an orange crayon. You can just combine red and yellow and you'll get orange. If you want to make purple, you don't need a purple crayon. You can just combine red and blue and you can make purple. But there are three primary colors, just like there are three primary genders. And the three primary genders will be masculine, feminine, and neuter. Now, like I said, normally, the masculine gender refers to a male animal. So a man would be masculine, a boy would be masculine, a bull would be masculine, a male dog would be masculine, and then feminine refers to female animals. So a woman would be feminine, a girl would be feminine, a wife would be feminine, sister would be feminine. And then with animals, we'd have like a hen would be feminine, a cow would be feminine, and things like that. That's pretty simple. The problem with Latin is that we learn that their idea of gender goes beyond that and doesn't only refer to natural gender, but it also refers to what's called grammatical gender. And so it gets a little more complicated, and we've really got to memorize the genders of different nouns that we use. Later on in a later lesson, we'll learn some rules for how to identify the gender of things that aren't living animals in grammar, but usually we have a good idea of this, and we even do this in English. For example, if I buy a boat, let's say I buy a boat, let's say I'm a wealthy guy, and I decide I want to buy a nice boat to take out on the ocean and sail around on vacation times, and I want to give my boat a name. What kind of name do people give boats? Who can tell me what kind of name people give boats? If I get a boat, yeah, for some reason, right, it's kind of weird. Yeah, Betsy, that's an example. Okay, we give a name to a boat and we think of a boat as feminine, right? Yeah, I don't know about Thrasher. That's a little normally boats are given feminine names, right? Because we think of a boat as a feminine thing, even though obviously it's not feminine at all. If you think about a river, let's take a river like the Nile River, the Amazon River, the Jordan River. Think about a river. If you just had to guess, what gender do you think a river would be? What gender do you think a river would be? You're guessing masculine, feminine, female, male, so we're not sure, right? So we think about different things in life, different nouns. And if I said you have to identify the gender of every noun, and then I gave you nouns like river or mountain or tree, or how about things like love or courage or prudence? And I said all of these nouns have to have a gender. We'd have to figure out what the gender would be. And fortunately, this is all already done for us. But when we study Latin, we have to learn these genders. It's easy for animals. It's easy to know the gender of animals. But when we get into the other nouns, it gets a little more difficult. And we have to learn to think about them the way that the Romans thought about them, because we're learning their language. So we have to learn about how they thought about genders. But what's important right now, and we're going to get into that more in future lessons, but what's important right now is that you can name the three genders. So real quick in the chat, name the three genders for me. Just list them, the three genders. Whoever can do it, do it. Name the three genders: masculine, feminine, neuter. Very good. Okay. So that's where we're going to start with. Masculine, feminine, and neuter. That's like red, yellow, and blue in crayons. Okay. They're the primary genders. All of the other genders that we're going to learn are really just combinations of these, or they're problems caused by these. Okay. So the three main genders are masculine, feminine, and neuter. And like I said, the reason why these are so important is because when words go together in Latin, like an adjective and a substantive, they have to have the same gender. That's actually how we know what's referring to what in a sentence. One of the signs we have is we can look at the gender. So if I ask you, I'll give you an example of this from our reading in Gospel of John. Now you got to pay attention here because this is going to get a little challenging mentally. So pay attention here. Let's find a good example here. Okay. Here we have this first sentence, in principio erat verbum, et verbum erat apud Deum, Deus erat verbum, hoc erat in principio. Now what I'd like you to do is look at this pronoun hoc, okay? This pronoun hoc, it's the subject of the sentence. So just answer my questions, okay? Don't try to overthink this. Just answer my questions. This word hoc in verse 2 is the subject of the sentence. So what case is hoc in? If hoc is the subject, if hoc is the subject of the sentence, what case is it? Very good. It's nominative case, okay? Great. So we know this is a nominative case. And what part of speech is hoc? What part of speech is the word hoc? What part of speech is the word hoc? Pronoun, pronoun, pronoun. Very good. So we have a pronoun in the nominative case. Good. Now this pronoun has different forms for different genders. The masculine form, and pay attention to this, this is important. The masculine form of this pronoun is hic, and I'll just write it in the chat so you can see it. Hic is the masculine form. Haik is the feminine form. And hoc is the neuter form. All right? So we've got three forms of this pronoun. Hic is masculine, haik is feminine, and hoc is neuter. So if you look at this word hoc, you see that it's the subject of the sentence. It's in the nominative case. And you see that the forms of this pronoun are hic, haik, and hoc. What is the gender of the pronoun hoc? What is the gender of the pronoun hoc? Neuter. Very good. All right. So we can know that hoc is a neuter pronoun. Now, who cares about this stuff, right? Who cares? Why do we need to talk about this, waste all our time talking about this silly stuff? Well, here's why. Ready? It's a pronoun. So it stands in place of a noun. And what we've got to ask is, what noun does it stand in place of? And the reason why that's important is because in the sentence before that, there are two different nouns. We have the noun, we have verbum, that's one noun. And then we also have deus, a second noun. So we've got two nouns in the first sentence. And then the second sentence starts with the word hoc. And what does the word hoc mean? What does the word hoc mean? It means this. Very good. Let's see. Hold on one second. Pelletiers, I see that you have a question. Is it a question about what we're talking about right now or a question about something else? Let me know real quick. Is it a question we need to ask right now or can we talk about it later? I'll wait for your answer on that. So this pronoun hoc refers back, okay. This pronoun hoc refers back to something that was already named in the previous sentence. But the problem is we named two different things. So there's no way for us to know which of those two things the pronoun is referring to. There's only one way for us to know that. And the way for us to know that is by the gender of this pronoun. Look at the noun deus. Who knows the gender of the noun deus? What is the gender of deus? It's masculine. Very good. And what is the gender of the pronoun hoc? What is the gender of the pronoun Hulk? It's neuter. Very good. That is proof, and pay attention to me here, that because they have different genders, Deus is masculine and Hulk is feminine, that proves for us that Hulk cannot be referring back to Deus because they're different genders. The other noun we have in the first sentence is verbum. What is the gender of verbum? What is the gender of verbum? It's neuter. Very good. It's neuter. Hulk is a neuter pronoun. So if I ask, what is Hulk referring to? You have two options, Deus and verbum. And if there's no way to tell, you would not be able to figure out what verse 2 is referring to. But there is a way to tell because of the gender of the nouns and the gender of the pronoun. Hulk is neuter. Deus is masculine. Verbum is neuter. So what noun is the pronoun Hulk referring to? What noun is Hulk referring to? No, Cecilia, you didn't follow me there. No, Xavier, you didn't pay attention there. Deus is masculine. Hulk is neuter. Hulk cannot be referring back to Deus. Verbum is neuter. Hulk is neuter. Hulk must be referring back to verbum. Okay? So when we see the translation, when you look at the translation and you try to wonder, how did they figure out what the right translation is? This is how they figure out what the translation is. This is how we figure out how to translate it and what it means. Okay? The only way that you can know what Hulk is referring to is by the gender. So gender in Latin is very important because a noun, a substantive, I should say, a noun and an adjective always have to agree in gender. A noun and a pronoun always have to have the same gender. So we can use gender to translate. And in Latin, it's very important. Whereas in English, we really don't care about gender that much. It's not that important. All right, let's look at another example here. In verse 5, we read, et lux in tenebris lucet, et tenebrae eam non comprehenderunt. And we've got this pronoun eam. Eam is a pronoun, okay? And does anyone know how we translate, if you already studied this passage, how we translated the pronoun eam? Does anybody remember? Don't guess, only answer if you know. It's translated it, okay? So we have in verse 5, and the light in the darkness shines, and the darkness it not did comprehend. What does the pronoun eam, what does the pronoun refer to? What noun is it standing in place of? What noun? And again, if you're not sure, don't answer. Just listen. If you're pretty sure, give an answer. Now, someone wrote darkness, someone wrote dark. If you think about the translation, that doesn't even make any sense. So I think you're guessing here. The translation is, and the light in the darkness shines, and the darkness it not did comprehend. So obviously the darkness did not comprehend it. Obviously the darkness is not what it is referring to. The darkness did not comprehend it. What is it? Some are still writing darkness, even though I just explained that it's not darkness. It's light. It's the light. All right. You've got to think. Don't just type. Don't just let your hands run wild. You know, they're connected to your brain. You know, make sure you're thinking before you type, right? Be slow to speak, quick to listen, quick to think, slow to speak, slow to write. So this pronoun eam is referring to something. It's translated as it. That's not very helpful. We have to know what it's referring back to. And we've identified this, and those of you who have written light are right. It's referring back to lux. It's referring back to light. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it. That is the light. Now, we have to know what the gender is of the noun in order to know what gender the pronoun should be. We get the answer from the noun. So anytime you want to know what gender an adjective should be or what gender a pronoun should be, you have to go back to the substantive noun. That's where we learn the gender. So if we were to look lux up in a dictionary, because the dictionary, Latin dictionary will tell you the gender. If we were to look lux up in a dictionary, what gender would lux be? Does anybody know what gender lux is? Don't guess. I asked, does anybody know what gender lux is? Does anybody know? Nope, not masculine. Let's look it up real quick. There's a simple dictionary on the internet, a simple Latin dictionary called Whitaker's Words. If you look at the web address, it's just latin-words.com. If you need a Latin dictionary, this is a good little tool to use, and I'll show you why. So if I just look up the word lux, it gives me this gobbledygook response here with all of this, secret information. We have the word here, and if we look what this tells us down here, the last letter, it tells us the gender. So this tells us that the word lux is nominative, it's singular, and it's feminine. And then down here, it tells us the meaning of the word. So the word lux, a Latin dictionary will tell us that it's feminine, okay? Lux is feminine. And let me just show you, if you've never used this dictionary before, let me just give you another example of what it can do that makes it so helpful. Just as a little help tip for Latin. Comprehenderunt. If I type in this verb, it does all the work for me. So I type in the verb, I have this form comprehenderunt, and it tells me everything I need to know about this verb. It tells me that it's perfect tense, it's active mood, it's third person, singular, it's indicative, and so on. And then it gives me all the possible meanings of the verb. So if you're ever doing translation work and you need some help from a dictionary that can actually tell you what the different forms means, this dictionary, Whitaker's Words, this tool online, can help you out. Now, it's not going to give you all the answers. You're still going to have to know the language, but a lot of times it's helpful, okay? So again, that's latin-words.com, and you can type in different forms of words, whereas in a normal Latin dictionary, you can't do that. You can only use one form. So it's a helpful tool. But anyway, what I wanted to show you is it tells us that lux is feminine. All right, so lux is feminine. So let's get back to our lesson. So lux is feminine, and if lux is feminine, if light is feminine, this is another one of those examples where we have a thing that's not an animal, and yet it has a gender. Why in the world would lux be feminine, right? It's kind of strange. But lux is feminine, and this pronoun here, am, refers back to lux. So what must be the gender of the pronoun am? What's the gender of am? Who's paying attention? What's the gender of am? Nope, Damien's not paying attention. Giovanni's not paying attention. The gender of am is feminine. It refers back to lux. It refers back to lux. Am is feminine because lux is feminine, all right? So the substantive noun has a gender built into it. And then if we use a pronoun to refer to that noun, we have to use the same gender. If we use an adjective to describe that noun, we have to use the same gender. If we use a participle, we have to make sure that we know the gender of the thing we're referring to with the participle. Why isn't am translated as her then? That's a very good question. Why don't we translate am as her? Now, here's why. Okay, that's a good question. If you were a Roman, or if you were a person who is communicating in Latin, when you hear the pronoun am, you would actually think her. You would actually think feminine. But in English, and this is just because of translation, in the Latin language, lux is feminine, and am in their brain does mean her. It's feminine, and it refers to a feminine thing. Just like a man would refer to his boat as she, right? You know, he might have his new boat and he's proud of his new boat, and she's like, yeah, she's a real beauty, right? He would actually refer to her as she, even though it was an inanimate object. So we do think like that, but in English, we translate it. And in English, we don't think of light as a feminine, we think of light as neuter. And so we would refer to light as it. That's normal English. We would say the light, it is bright. So we would use it to refer to light. Whereas in Latin, they would use she or her to refer to light. So in their brain, it would be feminine. But in our English brain, when we translate it so that it makes sense in English, and we say it, okay? But that's not actually what the Latin text says. The Latin text actually says her, and you're right about that, okay? And if you did translate it like that, you might confuse some English-speaking people, but you'd be right. Okay, so good. But what I wanted to show you here in these readings is that the pronouns have their genders based on the words that they refer to. Hulk is neuter because verbum is neuter. Am is feminine because lux is feminine. So it explains why things are the way they are. All right, so that's enough for that. We understand how the different words are formed and that they all have to agree and have the same gender, okay? And again, you're going to study this more and more in Latin grammar, so you don't have to master it all here. I just want to explain to you why gender is so important in Latin, why we don't talk about it much in English, but we talk about it constantly in Latin. So there are three principal genders: masculine, feminine, and neuter. And then there's a bunch of genders that come from these. And this starts in this second part of the rule, Rule 15. We learn of two other genders. One is called common of two, and one is called common of three. Common of two and common of three. And these names are kind of weird, but it's really very simple. If we talk about a certain thing, a certain word, let's say, and let's take a word like chicken, right? Chicken. What is the gender of chicken? What is the gender of chicken? And I'm not talking about meat, at dinner time. I'm talking about an animal, a chicken. What's the gender of chicken? You're going to say feminine. That's not actually right. Yeah, Xavier got it right. Xavier is right, okay? So a chicken can be a male or a female. What do we call a male chicken? What do we call a male chicken? A rooster, good. What do we call a female chicken? A hen, very good. Okay, so we've got names for these animals. All right, that's enough. We got it. We got hen. Calm down. We've got names for these animals that we can use to identify their gender, rooster and hen. But then we've got a more general name that refers to both. It refers just to any chicken, male or female. So you can see the word chicken is kind of weird because it refers to both genders, okay? So that's one thing. So we've got common of two can refer to both genders, and then we've also got common of three, and we're going to see it gets more complicated than that in Latin. But then common of three refers to all three genders. So there are words which can be masculine, feminine, and neuter. And an example of a common of three word would be an adjective. And again, this is in Latin, so we don't even have this really in English, but common of three would be a word like Felix, which means happy. And happy can refer to a masculine thing, a feminine thing, or a neuter thing. So if I say happy man, I could say vir, which means man. Vir Felix means a happy man. If I wanted to say a happy woman, I would say femina Felix, a happy woman. If I wanted to say, let's think of a neuter thing. I could think of temple gift, a happy gift, let's just say. Donum is neuter. Felix would be the adjective. So Felix could be masculine, feminine, or neuter. So there are some words that will have all three genders. Common of two has masculine and feminine gender. Common of three has all three genders. And then if we go down here, we learn about two more. In part C of this rule, we learn about another gender called promiscuous or epicene. And then in the last part, we learn about dubium, doubtful, or incertum, uncertain. All right, so we've got a total of 7 different possible genders. We've got masculine, feminine, neuter, common of 2, common of 3, and then we've got epicene, and lastly, doubtful. So we've got 7 possible genders in Latin, but really there's only 3, masculine, feminine, and neuter, and the rest are combinations of them, okay? So let's try to figure out what exactly do we mean by common of 2 and common of 3. Let's read this together here. Of these 3 principal genders are born 2 others, the common of 2 and the common of 3. The common of 2 is that to which are preposed the pronouns hic and haec, as hic and haec parens. That should say parens. So this gets a little confusing, and I want to explain what this means. Hic and haec, you'll see hic, haec, and hoc, and you may be wondering, like, what in the world is this lesson talking about? Well, if we want to identify the gender of a noun in Latin, we have to ask, how would we identify the gender? Okay, what kind of sign could we use? What kind of symbol could we use to identify a gender? And what the Latin speakers did was they chose to use a pronoun. They used a pronoun and they use it as a symbol of gender in grammar studies. They used the pronoun hic, haec, and hoc, which means this. We just talked about it when we looked at the Gospel of John. Hic, haec, and hoc. Hic is masculine. So if I want to identify a noun and say that this noun is masculine, let's take the word, let's take deus, right? If I wanted to show that deus is masculine, I could stick the pronoun hic next to it and say hic deus. Okay, hic deus, that shows us that deus is masculine. How do I know deus is masculine? I could say, because it's got the pronoun hic next to it, okay, set before it. So hic is a sign of the masculine, and you could put hic next to a word to show that it's masculine. Haec, H-A-E-C, haec, or haec in church Latin, that's feminine. So if I want to use it as a symbol to show that a word is feminine, like puella, which means girl, if I want to show that the word puella is girl, I could put the pronoun next to it and say haec puella. Okay, haec shows that it's feminine. And then hoc is neuter, so I can use that as a symbol of a neuter noun. So if I wanted to say this temple or the temple, I could say hoc templum, and I could show that templum is a neuter noun. So hic is used as a sign of a masculine noun, haec is used as a sign of a feminine noun, and hoc is used as a sign of a neuter noun. All right, so that's simple enough. But when we get to common of 2, and we ask, what in the world is this common of 2 thing? The answer is the common of 2 is that type of word to which are proposed the pronouns hic and haec. Hic being masculine, haec being feminine. And an example of this is the Latin noun parens, and that's a typo. I'll type it in the chat here. It's autocorrect. It turned it into parents. It should not say parents. It should say parens. Okay, that's the Latin word. The word parent is another example of common of 2. Who does the word parent refer to, your mother or your father? If I say my parent, who does it refer to? Both, right? It can mean your mother or your father, right? So the noun parent is an example of common of 2. That word actually has 2 different genders. It could be hic parens, like this. I'll write it here. If I say hic parens, who am I referring to? Hic parens. Who am I referring to if I say hic potens? Father, very good. And if I say haec potens, same noun, but I'm referring to the mother because I use the feminine sign, which is haec, okay? So the word potens can be masculine or feminine, and the way that I show that is by sticking the pronoun next to it in the right gender. So the common of two is that to which the pronouns hic and haec can both be set before, all right? So it's like chicken. Chicken would be the same thing. Okay, so parens is an example of common of two. And what you should just do when you study this is memorize the example that's given so that you don't forget it. It helps you to remember what the gender is just by remembering the example. Then we've got common of three, and common of three is a word that hic, haec, and hoc can stand before. So it can be masculine, feminine, or neuter. And the example that's given in the lesson here is the adjective prudens. Prudens means wise. And so if I wanted to say a wise man, I could say vir prudens. That means wise man. If I wanted to say a wise woman, I could say femina prudens. And if I wanted to say, I can't think of a neuter noun off the top of my head, so I'm just going to leave that off. But if I wanted to say a prudent something that was neuter, I could again use the word prudens. It's the same. Okay, so prudens can be masculine, can be feminine, can be neuter. So it's common of three. The pronoun hic, haec, and hoc can be set before the word prudens. That's what that means there. So common of two, common of three. And the most common example of common of three, the most common example would be an adjective noun. All right. So that's what common of two and common of three mean. Then we get down to the two more difficult ones. These can be a little confusing, and I want to just get through these quickly because we're just about out of time. We have the promiscuous and we have the doubtful. We read that the promiscuous gender to which under one gender and one article, either sex is included. So this gets a little confusing, okay? If we take the noun hic passer, so we say hic passer. The noun passer, and pay attention here because this is a little confusing, and I want to make sure it's clear. The noun passer means sparrow, so it's a kind of a bird, passer. It can refer to the male or the female. So if I saw a male sparrow, I could say, hey, look, there's a passer, there's a sparrow, right? A male sparrow. And if I saw a female sparrow, I could look at it and say, hey, look, there's a passer, a sparrow, a female sparrow. I could use the same word for both the male and the female, just like chicken. But this is different, okay? This is different. It's different because if I talk about the male sparrow, I would say hic passer, the male sparrow. But if I wanted to talk about the female sparrow, I would not say haec passer. I would say hic passer again, which is weird. So hic passer could mean male or female sparrow. So it's not like parent, because parent, we said hic parens is male and haec parens is female. Okay? We said it's just the way that this word is in Latin. It's the way that the Latin speakers used it. Okay? Remember, we're learning their language. So, sometimes they just did things the way they wanted to do them, and we have to learn it in order to understand their language. So if they refer to a male or a female sparrow or a male or a female crow, same thing is true of an eagle, they would use one form for the male or the female, and the pronoun would stay the same, which is the weird part, okay? just chill out on the chat because you're going to either confuse yourself or somebody else. Just try to follow me here because this is confusing. So you've got to understand when you study this lesson, you're not going to understand all of this in a live class. When you study this lesson, masculine, feminine, neuter, that's going to be easy, right? But when you get to common of two and promiscuous gender, you have to make sure you understand the difference, okay? Common of two is a noun, is a word, I shouldn't say noun, is a word that can be used for a masculine or for a feminine, but the pronoun will change. It'll be hic for the masculine and hike for the feminine. So the pronoun will change, but the word can be used for both genders. In the promiscuous gender, the word can be used for both genders, but only one gender pronoun will be used for both. That's the difference, all right? And I know this is difficult to follow, but you can review this video if you want to, so I'm not going to review it too much. So make sure that you study common of two, and then you study the promiscuous, and you understand what the difference is between the two. That's what's important. And then the last one to finish up here is the doubtful. The doubtful, which really means we just don't know. We don't know exactly what the gender is. So the rule says there is also the doubtful gender, which means uncertain, which has both articles, such as hic or hike silex, hic or hike vulgus. In other words, for the doubtful gender, we find one place where the Latin speakers thought of this thing as a masculine thing, and we find other places where masculine speakers talked about it as a feminine thing. So it's doubtful because it seems like they really didn't have their mind made up on which gender it was. Sometimes they refer to it as masculine, sometimes they refer to it as feminine. It's uncertain, it's doubtful. So those are the 7 genders, and I know that's a lot of information packed into one live class. If you're a younger student and you're staring at the computer screen wondering, what universe am I in? Just relax, because you're going to study this lesson on your own and take your time and work through it where everything is explained carefully. And you can review this video, and as you study, if you come back and review this video, it'll all start to make more sense to you. But what I wanted to do today was walk through all of the genders, explain why gender is important in Latin, and then look at the different options for what's available. We've got 3 primary genders, masculine, feminine, and neuter. Then we've got a bunch that are born of these. We've got common of 2, common of 3, epicene, and doubtful. Okay, so a total of 7 genders. So with all of this stuff in your head, I want to encourage you, if you haven't already, I want to encourage you to study this lesson in Latin grammar. Read through this lesson, study it while the discussion is fresh in your mind, and try to make your way through this Latin grammar course because it's really important. If you've got any questions about this stuff, the place to ask those questions is on the student forums. And just so you know, the student forums aren't supposed to be a place where you just post questions for me to answer. That defeats the point of the forum. You might as well just email if you're going to do that. The reason why I want you to post on the forums is because there are other students who already know the answer to these questions, and I'd like students to help one another, okay? It's good for you as a student. It's good for you as a student, and I'm not talking about the student forums, where you can just talk about whatever you want. I'm not talking about those. I'm talking about the forums on the course pages. So the forum on the Latin grammar course page. If you've got a question about a lesson or there's something you don't know about, post it on that forum on the course page. And if you're a student in that course, take a look through the posts on the forums and see if you can answer any of those questions. It's good for you to try to answer the questions because it challenges you to explain it. And Aristotle taught that we know that we really understand something when we're able to teach it to someone else. We know that we understand something when we're able to explain it to someone else. And so it's good for you as students to practice explaining things to other people, because that's going to show you that maybe you think you understand something, but then when you try to explain it to someone, you realize, I really don't understand it. And it's good for you to know that. And then if you're willing to work a little bit to try to figure out how to explain it, that'll help you to really master it as a student. So it's good for you not just to study, but to also try to help as a tutor for students who are just getting started, to explain things and try to answer their questions, not even for their sake, but for your sake, because it's good for you to do that. It's helpful for your own studies to do that, okay? So that's it. So that's all for that. I see some questions being posted, and I'll answer those questions in a bit, but I don't think everyone is interested in those questions. The question, Jude asks, why do we need to do Latin if nobody speaks it anymore? And I always laugh about these questions because I like that question. Let's say you're going to use as a rule for your life, I am so serious about my life. I am so serious about my time and my energy that if you can't explain to me why something is absolutely necessary, I don't want to do it. Are you really ready to commit to that rule for your life? You're really ready to commit to a rule where you're not going to do anything unless it is absolutely necessary for your life? Nothing else is going to be allowed? Then you've got to get rid of candy and ice cream. You don't need any special drinks. You can just drink water. You know, you don't need a blanket or a pillow. I mean, they're not necessary. You can just sleep on the floor. That's all you need. You just need a place to go to sleep. You don't need any comfortable shoes. You can just get the cheapest shoes. Maybe your mom can find a pair of shoes for you at the grocery store. They're good enough. That's all you need. But just what's absolutely nobody lives like that. So I don't know why we ask questions like that. Nobody lives like that. I like sleeping on the floor too. But anyway, we don't make decisions in life based only on what's absolutely necessary. And then we're going to have kids complaining about Latin, saying, why do we have to study Latin when it's not spoken anymore? And they turn around and play video games, which are obviously not necessary for anything, right? So, or they read some silly book that they like that's not necessary for anything. The reason why we study Latin, the first and main reason, is because if you're going to have a classical education, you want to be able to study historical resources. If you're a Catholic, almost all of the writings of the saints are in Latin. All of the writings of the church are in Latin. So if you're not going to learn Latin, you're just going to be limited to what happens to be an English translation. And to be honest, there's a lot of stuff that's very important that's not in English translation. You're not going to understand Latin prayers. You're not going to understand Latin hymns and songs. You're just going to sit there knowing nothing but English, like an uneducated person who never went to school. I don't know why anyone would want to do that. Languages open up entire new fields of study and knowledge to us. That's why we study languages. So I would say that every language that you could learn is valuable. I wouldn't say Latin is important and other languages are not important. If you can learn French and Spanish and German and Hebrew and any language you can learn is valuable. We study Latin primarily because this is a Catholic study program, and Latin is the language of the Catholic Church, always has been. So anyway, I want to let you guys get out of here because I know most of you don't want to talk about why we need to study Latin. So it's 2 o'clock. That's what I wanted to talk about today. I wanted to go through this lesson on genders. I know that was a lot of information. I don't spend a lot of time reviewing though, because I know you can review these videos as you need to, so there's no need for review, but that's all I wanted to share. So if you don't have any questions, you're free to go. I'm not going to get into anything else today. And if you do have any questions, I'm happy to hang around and chat a little bit. So post any questions that you want, and I'll answer as many as you have until you're done. So goodbye to everyone who is ready to leave. And if you have questions, I'll hang out for a while and answer them. Okay, take care, everybody.